Good morning, guys. I think it's actually afternoon already. Nope, it's 11:28. My day's going by fast getting these lessons ready for you. Today we're going to talk about genotypes. This is a set of notes that will hopefully answer some questions you might have generated in your mind about the part 2 questions on this lesson. But what we're going to be talking about when we're thinking genotype is the genes within an organism. So I'm going to go through some terms and some examples and look at some things that you're hopefully already familiar with because you just had to guess a whole bunch of things about them. Okay, so I want to talk about the word genotype first. That's actually what this lesson is about, and I don't think we've used it yet in the lesson. So here it is. You're going to write down the definition of it. A genotype is the genes within an organism. So the genes within an organism is another term for genome, Genome. So you could also write that down and then you know two words for the same thing. The genotype is going to be related to the phenotype, and I would write this down really quick just because it's going to be really good for future reference. But the phenotype is the trait an organism has. So the genotype is going to code for the trait. You have different genes that make proteins different ways, and sometimes when they make your proteins, you get red eyes when you're a fly, and sometimes you get brown eyes when you're a fly. Sometimes you get brown fur when you're a mouse, sometimes you get white fur. And those are related to your genotype getting translated into your actual proteins or the body parts of an organism. And so that's how these two things are related. But in this lesson, we're really just going to be focusing on the genotype. And so here's a bunch of examples of that. This is a set presumably from mom and dad crossing over. Remember, crossing over happens in meiosis. That's when the chromosomes wrap around each other and like transfer parts back and forth so that every single sperm will be different. Okay, this is showing you like a section of, like this is a section of DNA, so this is a gene. Here's another representation of it, just coiled. This is kind of what a chromosome would look like if you zoomed in. There's these little stones in the middle, or we call them stones, they're not obviously made of rock. And the chromosome wraps around those, and that's how we get the chromosome shape. And then these are just representing chromosomes. A lot of times when you see a chromosome represented like this, they're talking about like different gene segments. So here's a certain gene segment, here's another one. All right, let's get some more information about this. So genotype is also going to be really important for us to talk about for the rest of this class. So there's a couple of ways to talk about it. So your genotype, of course, could be referring to one gene, could be referring to one protein code within your body. It could also be referring to what's called a karyotype, which we'll write that down in the next slide. But a karyotype is a picture of all of your chromosomes. So what happens is that they take, here's some chromosomes that have been sorted out, and then they go ahead and they put them in order. So that's what this is right here. And remember, the DNA code of chromosomes is written in A's, T's, G's, and C's because we're not talking about RNA here. We're just talking about the genotype. And the last way that we talk about genotype, which you might have heard about before when you've done Punnett squares or something similar in a previous class, is that we write letters for it. So in this pea plant, the purple flowers are dominant to the white flowers. So there's 3 different genotypes that a pea could inherit, and 2 of those genotypes will code for purple flowers, and then one of them will end up having white flowers. But in this graph right here, the genotype is the genes itself, and the phenotype would be the trait. So the color of the flower is the phenotype, and the genotype is what's in that flower's DNA, like what's in the DNA of that plant. And depending on the genotype, the phenotype will be different. Okay, so write down those 3 ways to talk about it. You can be referring to one gene, you can be talking about a whole genotype or a whole karyotype in a genome, or you could be talking about one specific gene when you're doing Punnett squares, because we're going to do some Punnett squares in this class a little later. Okay, so let's talk about some more details about karyotypes. You've looked at several of them by this point, but now let's kind of talk about some of the rules of a karyotype. So a karyotype's definition is the arrangement of chromosomes into a chart or picture. So you basically take all of them and then you sort them. One of the questions you guys were supposed to answer is how do we put them in order? And so you might have noticed that they go from longest to shortest. Look at these little dinky ones down here at 22. So these get smaller and smaller and smaller until the last section, which is the sex chromosomes. And this is a female person because they have two X chromosomes. This is really easy for me to remember. Guys actually have less genes than girls. So if you've thought that females were better this whole entire time, you're right, because we actually have a complete set of DNA. Guys are missing basically half of this X chromosome, and they only have some of the genes that are on here. So if we had a male, then this would look a lot shorter because it would be a lot smaller, puny, sad. I'm just kidding, guys. I really think you're great, but it's the way I remember it, so it might help you. Um, you can get a lot of information looking at a karyotype. You can tell the diploid and the haploid number. Remember, diploid means a full set of chromosomes, a full set of genetic information. Haploid means half of that. So for humans, we have 23 pairs. We have 22 that we number, and then we have the sex chromosome. So that's 23 pairs. And so that would actually be the haploid number. We have half of our DNA would be 23. And if you multiply that by 2, you'd get our diploid number. So humans have 46 chromosomes. Another way to say that is 23 pairs. And then you can also determine the sex of someone by looking at one of these. There's a couple of mutations or chromosomal abnormalities that you can see. One of the questions you guys were supposed to look at was the one, and it had trisomy in 21. So if you're born with an extra version of this chromosome and you have 3 here instead of 2, then you're going to have Down syndrome. There's other genetic chromosomal or abnormalities that can occur where you can have too much or too little chromosomal information, and those all cause disorders. Some of the disorders are so severe that if you've ever known someone who had a miscarriage, it could be because the body realized that the chromosomes had not copied right in the original cells, and so now there would be no way for that infant to survive, and so your body just naturally aborts it through a miscarriage. So this does give you quite a bit of information. Usually, it does not tell you what genes an individual has. So we can't look at one of these and we can't tell like, oh, they have this version of a gene and this version. We can't tell from this information. Another thing you might be able to tell is if it's a human or not. So humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes or 46 total, but let's say you only had 12 sets of chromosomes here, then you would not be talking about a human being. So I just want you to know that there's quite a bit of information you can tell just by looking at this picture, as long as you know how to decode it. Okay, so here's one of the most interesting things in class that we ever learn about. Students love learning about this. But when we talk about reproduction in sexually reproducing organisms, which I mean, if you haven't written down that humans reproduce sexually, I mean, you already knew that because basically people are obsessed with sex, right? But this particular picture, I'm sorry, I'm having to rearrange this because you can't see it when I have it on full screen. This particular picture right here is going to show us a lot of information about, you know what, I forgot what I was saying, so I'm just going to delete this section out. Where do I go? Slideshow. So we're going to look at the gametes, and gametes are, of course, the sex cells. And when we're talking about genotype in the sex cells, they're really important. Because if you remember, we have mitosis and meiosis right here. These are just examples. This is a model. And the only thing that's showing in this model is the number of chromosomes in each of the cells and how many parent and daughter cells there are. So that's what this particular graph is showing us. And if you look at mitosis, the offspring cells are completely identical to the parent cells, or the divided cells are. The daughter cells is what we call them. And so that's represented right here by this female somatic cell and this male somatic cell. It says 44 plus XX. So in each of the cells of your body, even if it's like an eyeball cell or a liver cell, we can still look at that. This is one of the forensic things people have figured out. Even if all you have is even if all you have is a liver cell or a hair follicle, you can still tell if that person was male or female because there's going to be an XX chromosome in females and an XY in males. So you have 44 other chromosomes plus those two. Now, if we look at an egg, another word for egg is ovum, or if we look at sperm, sperm and eggs are only going to have 22 plus they're going to have a sex chromosome. All eggs are going to have an X chromosome, and half of sperm will carry an X and half will have a Y in them. So male cells are really the ones, the sperm, that determine the sex of the offspring. If you guys remember King Henry VIII from your history classes, he basically would have his wives killed, or he would divorce them, or send them off into have miserable lives, behead them. I think I already said beheading, but that's okay if I said it again. It was really his fault that he kept not birthing sons because none of the sperm he was sending to those eggs were the Y. So it's really his fault that he just kept having females. So this is why the population of the earth is generally half and half. We have half of those sperm are going to make boy babies and half of them will make girl babies. So I just wanted you guys to know that. So here is another representation of the X and the Y chromosome, and see how much shorter the Y is? It just doesn't have all the genes that the X has. So if we were going to take this karyotype, this has to be either from a fertilized egg or it has to be from a somatic cell because it has all of the pairs of chromosomes. Okay, haploid, remember, means half. So if we had a sperm and an egg, and the sperm had 46 chromosomes and the egg had 46 chromosomes, then we would have way too much genetic information to make a person. That's why in the end of meiosis, we get these 4 daughter cells, so that there's only half of the DNA needed to make a person, and that way you can have a whole person once you get those two together. If you reproduce asexually, so like through binary fission like bacteria do, or through mitosis like amoeba do, then the offspring are just going to be exactly like the parents, except if there is a mutation. Okay, I think that's all I want to tell you, but I might add a little bit later.